The infant's head had been placed on the kitchen counter with unnatural care. The neck was severed cleanly, as if by surgical precision, but the surrounding trauma was anything but controlled. Blood had soaked into the white tile grout, pooled in thick patches beneath the torso, and splattered across the lower cabinets. Stab wounds to the child's face and skull were clustered and deep, suggesting a frenzied attack, not a singular or impulsive strike. The body, lifeless and still clothed in a blood-stained onesie, had been positioned next to the sink. A large kitchen knife lay beside it, its blade slick, its handle gripped by small, bloodied fingers not capable of holding it unaided. At 9:31 a.m., a male relative of the child's guardian called emergency services. His voice was unsteady, his words fractured. He reported that a baby, his cousin's child, was lying dead in his mother's kitchen, decapitated. He stated he did not know where the mother was. The dispatcher asked if the baby was breathing. He responded flatly, "The baby is deceased." Moments later, first responders entered the residence, weapons drawn, moving with caution. In cases involving extreme violence and unknown suspect locations, protocol dictates a methodical, room-by-room clearance. Inside the master bedroom, officers located the child's grandmother, Deborah Stewart, semi-conscious and disoriented. In a second bedroom, under a heavy blanket, they found the mother, Deasia Watkins. She was lying on her side, hair partially covering her face, eyes closed. There was blood on her hands, under her fingernails, and smears on her arms and shirt. She did not resist when handcuffed. She did not ask about the baby. She said nothing at all. From a criminological perspective, the scene presents clear indicators of overkill and post-offense staging. The placement of the child on the counter, coupled with the insertion of the knife into the baby's hand, suggests an attempt to reconstruct or reframe the reality of the crime. This behavior is not indicative of rational cover-up, as the explanation is implausible on its face. Rather, it suggests a fractured cognitive state, one in which the perpetrator attempts to shift responsibility through symbolic gestures rather than logical deception. This aligns with known behaviors in cases involving psychotic offenders who, while detached from reality, retain residual notions of guilt, fear, or accountability. The nature of the wounds provides further insight. Stab patterns on the face and head show signs of concentrated force, with no defensive injuries visible on the infant. This implies the child was either asleep or unable to react, as expected for a 3-month-old. The injuries to the cervical region indicate repeated attempts at decapitation, followed by a successful severing of the head. The level of violence and specific targeting of the child's face and skull supports a hypothesis of projected aggression, an outward expression of internalized psychological distress. At this stage, motive remains obscured by the brutality. There is no evidence of an external threat, no forced entry, and no third-party involvement. The apartment was locked from the inside. All indications point to the mother acting alone. The presence of family members in the home, including a guardian figure who claimed to be unaware of Deasia's presence, raises further procedural concerns but does not immediately alter the trajectory of behavioral analysis. The lack of an emotional response from Deasia following discovery is also significant. Emotional flatness, particularly in the aftermath of violence, may suggest acute dissociation. This symptom is common in individuals experiencing psychosis, especially in postpartum cases where the delusion centers around the child. In such instances, the mother may cease to perceive the infant as her own, instead reinterpreting the child as a source of harm, judgment, or supernatural threat. When this psychotic frame is activated, normal maternal inhibition dissolves, and violence can be recontextualized as an act of salvation or control. Staging the body in the kitchen, particularly on a flat, sterile surface, is not arbitrary. It can reflect an internal attempt at ritual cleansing or symbolic display. In documented cases of maternal filicide driven by religious or paranoid delusions, the body is often repositioned or altered in ways that mirror the perpetrator's distorted beliefs. While no explicit religious artifacts were found at the scene, the choice of setting and the anatomical precision used in the decapitation suggest a convergence of control, symbolism, and chaos. The crime scene, in its totality, does not reflect a calculated murder for personal gain, revenge, or escape. It reflects a mental break, a collapse of identity and reality, where the boundaries between self, child, and delusion disintegrate. However, the residual awareness needed to stage elements of the scene complicates the narrative. It suggests the presence of a fragmented but functioning executive system, one still capable of intention, even if divorced from rationality. What compelled Deasia Watkins to kill her own child in this manner? The crime scene offers many answers, but none fully account for the psychological fracture required to justify such violence. Further analysis must turn inward, to the weeks preceding the attack, to the failure of systems designed to intervene, and to the signs that were missed or ignored. Only then can the underlying pathology begin to come into focus. In the weeks preceding the homicide, Deasia Watkins exhibited a pattern of behavioral decline marked by escalating psychotic symptoms, poor judgment, and a gradual withdrawal from reality. Multiple reports from those in close proximity to her indicated increasing episodes of paranoia, religious preoccupation, and emotional volatility. These reports, corroborated by audio recordings and first-hand observations, provide a clear trajectory of psychological decompensation, consistent with the diagnosis of postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis is characterized by a rapid onset of delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, and abrupt mood shifts. Unlike postpartum depression, which often involves feelings of sadness, guilt, and exhaustion, postpartum psychosis tends to present with a break from reality and a distorted perception of self and others. In Deasia's case, the onset appeared within 2 months of childbirth and followed a recognizable pattern: sleep disruption, disorganized speech, and escalating paranoia centered on the infant. Witnesses described episodes in which Deasia believed that demonic forces were targeting her and her child. She reportedly claimed that her daughter was not safe and that something was trying to take her. These beliefs are not uncommon in psychotic maternal cases, where the mother becomes convinced that external threats, real or imagined, are attempting to harm or possess the child. Under this cognitive framework, the mother may interpret even benign situations as dangerous, and her actions can become both defensive and preemptively violent. Audio recordings captured by her partner revealed emotional instability alternating with religious declarations and expressions of intense fear. In one segment, Deasia could be heard pleading for divine intervention, questioning her own sanity, and begging to be released from what she believed was spiritual persecution. Such expressions suggest internal distress, but more significantly, they reflect a distorted belief system in which the child is either the object of threat or the threat itself. This distinction becomes critical when examining motivation in psychotic filicide. Despite clear signs of deteriorating mental health, Deasia continued to resist treatment. She avoided taking prescribed antipsychotic medication, citing concerns about side effects and breastfeeding. While such concerns are common among new mothers, in her case, refusal to comply with medical guidance occurred in parallel with worsening symptoms. This raises questions about her insight, a clinical term referring to a patient's awareness and understanding of their illness. Deasia appeared to lack both insight and trust in external authority, perceiving psychiatric intervention not as help, but as intrusion. Interactions with caseworkers further support the conclusion that she did not accept the seriousness of her condition. She minimized prior incidents, avoided eye contact during interviews, and responded to safety planning requirements with passive resistance. While these behaviors may seem benign, in a psychiatric context, they reflect a dangerous combination of delusional belief and perceived persecution. The more others tried to intervene, the more she withdrew, reinforcing the internal narrative that she alone could protect her child. This internal logic, though irrational, forms the core of psychotic maternal reasoning. In several documented cases, mothers experiencing postpartum psychosis have described a sense of mission or purpose in their actions, believing that they were saving the child from future suffering, possession, or damnation. These motivations are not based in reality, but are deeply felt and internally justified. For the affected individual, the act of killing may not be experienced as aggression, but as sacrifice. Deasia's relocation to her aunt's home, under court order that she have no contact with her daughter, represented a critical breach in protective oversight. Although the arrangement was temporary and supposedly supervised, she soon re-established physical access to the child. Her aunt, reportedly overwhelmed and in poor health, allowed Deasia to move in. This development effectively removed all structural barriers between mother and child, while placing responsibility on a caregiver who lacked both the training and capacity to monitor psychiatric risk. In this new environment, without therapeutic oversight or medication, Deasia's delusions intensified. She began to isolate within the home, reportedly spending long periods alone in the bedroom with the infant. There were no further external reports of incidents, but absence of evidence does not imply stability. Psychotic breaks can occur suddenly, and when paired with perceived threats to maternal identity or custody, they can trigger catastrophic decisions. The question of premeditation becomes increasingly difficult to assess in this context. Her refusal to take medication, her concealment within the household, and her defiance of court orders all indicate volitional behavior. Yet, these decisions were made within a framework of delusional belief, one in which every external rule or intervention was interpreted as danger. This cognitive distortion blurs the boundary between intent and illness. She was not planning a crime in the conventional sense, but she was preparing, internally, for an imagined battle to retain control over her child. Understanding her psychological state in the hours leading up to the homicide requires attention to this convergence of perceived persecution, maternal identity collapse, and emotional disintegration. The absence of overt aggression prior to the event is not evidence of calm, but of internal escalation. Individuals in psychotic states often appear passive until a triggering moment forces a resolution between delusion and perceived threat. Whether such a moment occurred during a hallucination, a routine caretaking task, or a simple interaction with the child remains unknown. What is clear is that by the time violence was enacted, Deasia no longer recognized the infant as her daughter. She recognized only a threat, one that could not be reasoned with, only destroyed. What remained to be uncovered was how this transformation occurred in real time, and what, if anything, could have interrupted it before it reached its irreversible conclusion. On the morning of March 16th, the psychological rupture reached its peak. According to forensic evidence and investigative timelines, the fatal event occurred in the early hours, likely between 4 and 6 a.m., a window during which all other occupants of the house were either asleep or sedated. Deasia Watkins had been alone with the infant in a confined bedroom, unsupervised and untreated, for several consecutive nights. Environmental conditions, overstimulation, lack of sleep, emotional isolation, likely contributed to a state of acute psychotic destabilization. While no direct witness accounts exist for the exact moment of the homicide, the condition of the crime scene allows for a behavioral reconstruction. The child had been in her crib before the incident, but was later found on the kitchen counter. The presence of both dried and wet blood on Deasia's clothing, as well as a trail of partial footprints, suggests that she moved the body immediately after the act, during a dissociative or ritualized state. Blood spatter analysis indicates close-range stabbing, applied with repeated force to the face and skull, followed by decapitation using a serrated kitchen knife. There is no evidence of hesitation wounds or incomplete attempts, which suggests full commitment to the action once initiated. The decision to move the body to the kitchen, an open, visible area, contrasts sharply with the private nature of the killing itself. From a psychological perspective, this behavior aligns with ritualized compulsion, often observed in religious or delusional killings. The kitchen, associated with nourishment and cleansing, may have symbolized purification or presentation. The placement of the severed head on a clean surface and the subsequent insertion of a small knife into the infant's hand were not functional acts. These were symbolic. In forensic psychiatry, such staging is often interpreted as an attempt by the offender to rewrite the narrative of the violence, embedding it within a personal belief system that renders it justifiable. Deasia's post-offense behavior was marked by a lack of evasion. She did not flee the scene. She did not conceal the body. She returned to bed, covered herself, and remained silent. Such actions are not indicative of guilt-driven concealment, but rather reflect psychological exhaustion following a psychotic break. Her affective flatness during arrest and immediate post-arrest processing further supports this interpretation. Individuals in this state often experience emotional numbness and disconnection from their surroundings, which can last hours or even days following the resolution of a delusional crisis. The timing of the event is also significant. Early morning hours are a common window for psychotic episodes, particularly in individuals with disrupted sleep cycles and intrusive thought patterns. Sleep deprivation lowers cognitive resistance to intrusive delusions, making them more vivid and believable. This biological vulnerability, combined with an untreated psychotic disorder, would have left Deasia in a highly unstable mental state, primed for impulsive and catastrophic decision-making. One key behavioral detail warrants closer examination. Prior to the incident, there were no reported arguments, threats, or stressors within the household. The act did not appear reactive or provoked by external conflict. This absence of external stimuli suggests that the homicide was driven entirely by internal mechanisms. In such cases, the trigger is not an argument, but a moment of belief, the instant when the distorted reality becomes undeniable to the subject. It is in that moment that action becomes, in the mind of the offender, necessary. The excessive violence focused on the infant's head, multiple deep puncture wounds, followed by complete decapitation, points to a psychological mechanism known as annihilation of identity. In psychotic maternal homicides, especially those involving delusions of possession or corruption, the face becomes a symbolic locus. The attack becomes an attempt not just to end life, but to destroy what the subject perceives as false, threatening, or inhabited. The fact that Deasia did not attempt to harm herself afterward may indicate that the violence was externally directed only, reinforcing the hypothesis that she viewed the child not as part of herself, but as an independent source of danger. Later interviews confirmed that she had been experiencing intense delusional thinking centered on custody, spiritual invasion, and the belief that others were conspiring to take her child away. These beliefs likely converged into a persecutory psychotic construct, an internal narrative wherein violence was not only permitted but required. From a criminological standpoint, this form of instrumental psychosis, a delusion in service of action, remains one of the most dangerous clinical profiles, particularly when combined with caregiver access and lack of monitoring. The absence of immediate confession, followed by inconsistent and implausible explanations, supports the assessment of disorganized thought. Her shifting claims, first blaming her aunt, then referencing spiritual interference, demonstrate a fractured internal logic, not premeditated deception. She did not construct a coherent alibi or timeline. Instead, her account shifted with each question, guided not by strategy, but by the unstable architecture of delusional memory. What remained uncertain was the precise nature of her mental state in the hour before the killing. Was there a final moment of clarity? Did she perceive, even briefly, the child as her own flesh and blood before acting, or had the identity of the victim already been fully replaced in her mind? The answers to these questions would determine not only how the act was understood legally, but also what level of accountability, if any, could be applied. Deasia Watkins was interviewed twice by detectives from the Cincinnati Police Department's Criminal Investigation Section. The initial session, conducted shortly after her arrest, yielded no substantive information. She remained silent, unresponsive, and emotionally flat. Her body language was passive. She refused to sign forms acknowledging her Miranda rights and showed no visible reaction when told the child was dead. This presentation was consistent with post-psychotic dissociation, a state of mental shutdown following extreme psychological distress or break from reality. The second interrogation occurred 3 days later, after she had undergone initial psychiatric evaluation and stabilization. This session marked a shift in engagement. She acknowledged her rights, answered basic questions, and allowed herself to be photographed and processed. Her demeanor remained subdued, but she was now communicative. What followed was not a confession in the traditional sense, but a fragmented and disturbing narrative, marked by internal inconsistencies and cognitive disorganization. Throughout the interview, Watkins alternated between vague denials and partial admissions. At first, she claimed not to remember what happened. When shown evidence, blood on her clothing, her fingerprints on the knife, the child's injuries, she acknowledged physical involvement, but denied responsibility. She suggested her aunt had harmed the child, even though forensic evidence placed her alone in the bedroom during the time of death. These shifting statements are common in cases involving psychotic delusions. The subject does not fabricate details to deceive, but rather reconstructs reality to align with distorted beliefs. As the detectives gradually increased pressure, using emotional appeals and logical contradictions, Watkins began to provide more direct answers. She admitted to stabbing the child multiple times and stated that she decapitated her because she wouldn't die. This phrasing reflects a psychotic interpretation of bodily resistance. In her mind, the infant's continued movement may have signaled supernatural endurance, reinforcing her delusion that the child was possessed or inhuman. Such interpretations are common in psychotic offenders, particularly when the delusion includes spiritual or apocalyptic themes. She also claimed that she was trying to protect the child from others, unnamed forces that were trying to take her. This belief aligns with persecutory delusions, in which the subject believes external entities are targeting them or their loved ones. From a psychological standpoint, this transforms the act of violence into a perceived act of protection. The crime, though objectively destructive, is internally framed as necessary or even merciful. Watkins displayed no signs of malingering. Her affect remained flat, even as she described extreme violence. She did not cry or express remorse. She did not seek sympathy. Her tone was disconnected, lacking emotional context. This absence of effective response is not necessarily indicative of sociopathy, but rather of blunted emotional processing common in psychosis. Emotional numbing can persist even after the acute delusional episode has passed. At times, she referenced divine punishment, sin, and voices. She made no specific claims of auditory hallucinations commanding her to act, but her language suggested a belief in spiritual influence or divine mandate. When asked whether she regretted her actions, she responded, "I don't feel bad," followed by a vague reference to the child not being the same. These statements reflect derealization, a dissociative symptom where the individual loses connection to their environment or to the humanity of others. The detectives employed a variety of interrogation techniques, including rapport building, soft confrontation, and emotional redirection. They referenced her partner's concern, her family's shock, and the child's innocence. These tactics, commonly used to elicit confession, had limited impact. Watkins remained emotionally inert. Her cognitive rigidity, her inability to reassess the event in non-delusional terms, suggested that the psychotic framework remained dominant, even after partial stabilization. Forensic psychologists, reviewing the interrogation footage, noted that while Watkins appeared aware of the consequences, she lacked emotional integration. She understood she was being questioned about a murder, but did not display the corresponding psychological weight. This is a critical distinction in forensic evaluation. Cognitive understanding of right and wrong is not the same as moral comprehension. The latter requires the subject to internalize the emotional meaning of the act, which she did not demonstrate. Her final admission, stating clearly that she cut off the head because the child was still moving, confirmed the violent sequence already established by physical evidence. It also confirmed the core of her delusional thinking, the belief that the child's body needed to be destroyed to stop a perceived threat. Whether she believed the child to be possessed, corrupted, or replaced remains unclear. She never used those terms directly. However, her statements implied a disconnection between the identity of the child and the body she attacked. The interrogation concluded without a full explanation or moment of clarity. There was no expressed motive beyond fragmented references to danger and confusion. The psychological portrait that emerged was one of profound mental illness, filtered through the lens of deteriorated maternal identity and delusional logic. She remained under psychiatric observation following the interview. What remained for legal and psychiatric professionals to determine was whether Watkins understood the moral wrongfulness of her actions at the time of the crime. The next phase would require assessment, not just of her mental illness, but of her capacity for criminal responsibility under the law. Following the interrogation and psychiatric evaluation, the legal system faced a complex question: whether Deasia Watkins could be held criminally responsible for her actions under the standards of legal insanity. The threshold for such a defense is high. It requires not only the presence of a severe mental disorder, but proof that the individual, at the time of the offense, was incapable of understanding the nature or wrongfulness of the act. Forensic evaluators determined that Watkins was suffering from a psychotic disorder, consistent with postpartum psychosis at the time of the killing. However, their findings also indicated that she exhibited partial awareness of her actions. She engaged in behaviors that suggested a basic understanding of consequences, refusing medication, violating custody arrangements, attempting to shift blame during interviews, and staging the scene in a way that implied some effort to reframe the narrative. These behaviors, while not definitive evidence of criminal intent, complicated the assertion that she was wholly incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. The court ordered further psychiatric treatment to assess competency. After a period of stabilization, Watkins was found competent to stand trial. Competency, unlike criminal responsibility, evaluates whether a defendant can understand legal proceedings and participate in their defense. Her competency ruling indicated restored cognitive function, though it did not address her mental state during the homicide itself. Ultimately, the case did not proceed to trial. In 2017, Deasia Watkins entered a plea of guilty to the charge of murder, avoiding the uncertainty of an insanity defense. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, with eligibility for parole after 13 years. The plea agreement allowed the court to acknowledge the role of mental illness while imposing a sentence that reflected the gravity of the act. From a legal standpoint, this resolution balanced accountability with compassion, but it did not resolve the underlying clinical ambiguity. Criminologically, the Watkins case highlights several overlapping failures in risk management, mental health intervention, and protective supervision. The subject exhibited clear signs of psychiatric decline, which were documented by professionals and observed by family. Despite this, she maintained unsupervised access to her child. The protective measures in place were insufficiently enforced, relying heavily on voluntary compliance from an individual with impaired judgment and distorted perception. This case also illustrates the limitations of categorical thinking in criminal justice. The binary of sanity versus insanity fails to capture the complexity of mental illness and its effect on behavior. Psychotic individuals may retain certain cognitive functions while lacking emotional regulation or moral clarity. The presence of planning, manipulation, or post-offense behavior does not automatically negate the role of illness, nor does it fully explain the decision to act violently. Watkins's actions cannot be understood solely through legal frameworks or psychiatric diagnosis. Her behavior reflected a convergence of untreated psychosis, systemic oversight failure, and internal collapse of identity. In the absence of early and enforced intervention, the delusions progressed unchecked, culminating in an act of irreversible violence. The victim was not selected based on opportunity or resentment, but because she had become inseparable from the source of the offender's fear. In that altered mental state, the child no longer represented life, but threat. The broader implication of the case concerns how institutions respond to early warning signs. Postpartum psychosis is rare, but highly dangerous when left untreated. The condition is medically understood, clinically documented, and, in many jurisdictions, subject to mandatory reporting when it poses a risk to minors. The systems designed to identify and respond to these crises failed to act decisively, allowing a preventable tragedy to occur. The case of Deasia Watkins is not an anomaly, but part of a pattern observed in forensic psychiatric evaluations of infanticide. It reflects the difficulty in balancing civil liberties with involuntary treatment and the consequences of erring on the side of inaction. It also demonstrates the psychological reality that some offenders, while not evil in the traditional sense, are capable of causing immense harm under the influence of distorted belief systems. In the end, the homicide of Janaya Watkins remains an act of extreme violence, committed under extreme psychological conditions. It challenges the assumptions made about motive, awareness, and control. It underscores the importance of early psychiatric care, rigorous enforcement of protective orders, and sustained oversight in cases involving known psychiatric risk. The distinction between madness and murder is not always one of intent, but of context, what the offender believed, what systems allowed, and what might have been prevented.